The first time I heard it, I thought it was a fault in the amplifier. That's the part nobody believes when I tell the story now. They expect me to say I knew immediately, that some animal part of me recognized what we were touching. But I was tired, and the lab was cold, and the coffee in my mug had gone the color of dishwater 2 hours earlier. And when the waveform on my left monitor produced a small, regular hiccup at 7.83 Hz, my first thought was that DeWitt had unplugged the grounding strap again to charge his phone. He did that sometimes. He apologized every time. It was a running joke. I leaned back in my chair and called his name across the partition, and he answered with his mouth full of something. Almonds. I think he was always eating almonds in those weeks before his wife's due date. And said no, he hadn't touched anything. Why? I told him about the hiccup. He came around to look. We watched it together for maybe 40 seconds. It was so small, a little catch in the rhythm of the recording, like a hesitation in someone's breathing. The subject in the next room, a graduate student named Priya, who was earning $60 to lie still under an EEG cap and think about a memory of her grandmother, had no idea anything was happening. We could see her on the monitor. Her eyes were closed. Her mouth was slightly open. She looked like she was almost asleep. DeWitt said it was probably Maine's hum. I said Maine's hum is 60 Hertz in this country, 50 in his, and this was neither. He said it was probably her phone. I said her phone was in the locker outside the Faraday cage. He said it was probably my imagination. I laughed, because that was the kind of thing we said to each other at 2 a.m. when the building was empty, and the only other sound was the ventilation and the occasional groan of the old freight elevator 3 floors down. We were friends. We had been friends for almost 6 years by then. He had been at my wedding. I had held his first daughter when she was 9 days old and screamed the entire time I held her, and he had laughed about it for a year afterward. I want you to understand that, because of what came later. We were friends. I marked the timestamp, and we went back to our work. The hiccup repeated 4 more times that night, at intervals that were not quite regular, but not random either. I didn't mention it again. I went home at 4 a.m. and slept until 11, and woke up thinking about it, the way you wake up thinking about a song you can't place. The lab was on the 4th floor of a building that used to belong to the linguistics department before they got their renovation, and we got their leftovers. We had 2 recording rooms, a control area, a wet lab we almost never used, and an office that we shared with a printer that jammed if you breathed on it wrong. There were 6 of us on the project that semester, plus our PI, Dr. Halpern, who showed up on Tuesdays and Thursdays and otherwise communicated through emails that always seemed to be sent at 4 a.m. We were studying the entrainment of human alpha rhythms to externally generated low-frequency stimuli. That is the boring way to say it. The interesting way is that we were trying to figure out why the human brain, given a slow rhythmic input, a drum, a tone, a flicker of light, will sometimes start beating along with it, and sometimes refuse, and sometimes do something stranger than either. The Schumann resonance is 7.83 Hz. That's the frequency at which the cavity between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere naturally rings, excited by lightning strikes anywhere on the planet. It's a real thing. You can look it up. There are people who have built entire careers around the idea that the human brain is somehow tuned to it. And there are other people who have built entire careers around explaining why those first people are wrong. We were not interested in either argument. We were interested in the much narrower question of whether you could nudge an alpha rhythm toward or away from that frequency with simple acoustic stimuli, and what that nudging felt like from the inside. The hiccup was at 7.83 Hz. I want to be specific. It was not near it. It was not in the neighborhood. When I ran the spectral analysis the next morning, sober and showered, and on my second coffee, the peak landed on 7.83 Hz to 3 decimal places, and it sat there like it had been placed there by hand. I showed it to Halpern on Tuesday. He was a careful man. He had a way of looking at data that made you feel like the data was lying to him personally, and he was deciding whether to forgive it. He looked at my analysis for a long time. He asked me 3 questions. He asked what equipment I had used. He asked whether the subject had any history of seizure activity. He asked whether I had told anyone else. That 3rd question was the one I remembered later. I said I had told David. He nodded. He said it was probably an artifact. He said artifacts at suspiciously round numbers were almost always equipment. Almost always. And that I should run a calibration sweep on the amplifier and forward him the results. He said it in his usual careful voice, and he smiled at me in his usual careful way, and I didn't think anything of it at the time. I went and ran the calibration sweep. The amplifier was fine. I sent him the results. He didn't reply for 2 days, and when he did, it was a 1-line email that said, "Interesting. Let's discuss in person." H. We never had that discussion. On Thursday morning I came in and found Priya sitting on the bench outside our lab, crying. She was a tough kid. I had never seen her cry. She was holding her phone in both hands like it was something she had found in the street and didn't know what to do with. When she saw me, she stood up and asked very carefully whether she was allowed to ask me a question that wasn't about the study. I said of course. She asked me whether I had been thinking about her grandmother. I said no. I said I didn't know her grandmother. I had never met her grandmother. Her grandmother had been dead for 6 years. She said that on the night of the recording, the night of the hiccup, she had been lying in the chair with her eyes closed, doing what we asked her to do, remembering a specific afternoon when her grandmother had taught her to fold dumplings on the kitchen counter of the apartment in Pune where she grew up. And in the middle of the memory, she had heard very clearly, in a voice that was not her grandmother's and not her own and not anyone's she recognized, the words, "We hear you," not in English, not in any language. She couldn't explain how she knew what the words meant if they weren't in a language. She just knew. She had thought she was falling asleep. She had not mentioned it. She had gone home and not slept for 3 nights, and on the 3rd night, she had woken up at 2:14 a.m. with the certainty that someone was standing at the foot of her bed, and there had been no one there. And she had spent the rest of the night sitting on her kitchen floor with the lights on. And she was telling me now because she was going to drop out of the study, and she wanted to tell someone first who would not laugh at her. I did not laugh at her. I sat down next to her on the bench, and I asked her as gently as I could whether she had felt anything strange physically during the recording, anything in her body. She thought about it. She said her teeth had hurt, just for a second, like a high note in a song you can't hear. I walked her to the elevator. I told her she had done nothing wrong. I told her the study was fine, the data was fine, and we would refund her the full participation fee. I went back into the lab and I sat at my desk for a long time, and I did not turn on my computer. David came in around 11. He took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I told him. I told him all of it. The hiccup, the calibration, Halprin's email, Priya on the bench, the dumplings, the voice, the teeth. He listened the way he always listened, with his hands folded on the desk and his head slightly tilted, and when I was done he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Jonas had it too." Jonas was a postdoc who had left the program 8 months earlier. I had assumed he had gone back to Addis Ababa for family reasons. That was the story we had been told. David said no. David said Jonas had come to him in October, almost a year before, with a recording he had made on his own time, off the books, using a single-channel rig he had built in the wet lab when no one was watching. David said Jonas had asked him to look at it and tell him whether he was losing his mind. I asked what was on the recording. David said, "A hiccup at 7.83 hertz, repeating, not random, not regular. Beneath it, when you stretched the time domain out and listened with the right filters, something that sounded almost like..." And here David stopped, and chose his words very carefully, the way he did when he was about to say something he didn't believe and didn't want to be the first person to say out loud. Something that sounded almost like a second waveform, a modulation, as if the 7.83 was a carrier and there was something riding on it. I asked him why he hadn't told me. He said because Jonas had asked him not to. Because Jonas had been frightened and embarrassed about being frightened and had wanted to rule things out before he made noise. And then a week later, Jonas had stopped answering messages, and 10 days after that, there had been the email from Halprin about the family emergency in Ethiopia, and Dawit had assumed, he had wanted to assume, that the two things were unrelated. I asked whether Jonas's recording still existed. Dawit said he didn't know. He said he had a copy on a personal drive at home. He said he hadn't looked at it in months. He said he would bring it in tomorrow. He didn't bring it in tomorrow. Tomorrow was a Friday, and on Friday morning Halpern called a meeting of the entire lab. All 6 of us plus 2 people I had never seen before. A woman in a grey suit who introduced herself as being from the university's research compliance office, and a man who didn't introduce himself at all. Halpern told us, in his careful voice, that the entrainment study was being suspended pending an internal review. He said there had been some questions raised about subject welfare protocols. He said all current data was being sequestered for the duration of the review. He said our access cards would be reissued on Monday with updated permissions. He said no one was in any trouble. He said this twice. The man who didn't introduce himself watched us while Halpern talked. He didn't take notes. He just watched. I remember thinking that he had the stillness of someone who had been trained to be still. And I remember thinking that this was a strange thing to think about a man in a research compliance meeting. After the meeting, I tried to find Dawit. He wasn't at his desk. His coat was gone. I called his phone and it went straight to voicemail. I told myself he had probably gone home early because his wife was 8 months pregnant and tired, and it was a Friday. I told myself that for the rest of the afternoon. I told myself that all weekend. On Monday, his desk was empty, not cleared out. Empty. The almonds were gone. The framed picture of his daughter was gone. The mug that said, "World's okayest dad," that I had given him as a joke for his birthday was gone. His chair had been replaced with a different chair. I asked the department secretary where he was. She looked at me with a small, tight, professional smile and said she didn't have any information about that. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant she didn't have any information about that. I went home that night and I called his wife. The number had been disconnected. I want to slow down here because I know how this sounds. I know the shape of this story. I have read versions of this story myself on the internet late at night and not believed them. I want to tell you what I actually felt in those first weeks because the feeling was not what you would expect. The feeling was not fear. The feeling was a kind of slow, dull confusion, like waking up in a hotel room and not remembering which city you are in. I went to work every day. My access card still worked, although it now only opened the office and the bathroom and the seminar room on the 2nd floor. The recording rooms were locked. I was reassigned to a literature review on transcranial direct current stimulation in patients with treatment-resistant depression. It was not interesting work. It was the kind of work you give a graduate student who has annoyed you. I did it. I did it for 11 days. On the 12th day, I went to the wet lab on my lunch break, and I found Jonas's old rig. It was in a cardboard box on the top shelf of the storage cabinet, behind 2 dead oscilloscopes and a rolled-up poster from a 2014 conference. I don't know why I looked there. I had been looking everywhere in a half-hearted way, in moments when no one was watching me. The rig was a single-channel EEG amplifier, hand-soldered, with a homemade Faraday hood made from copper mesh and electrical tape. There was a USB drive taped to the bottom of the unit with a piece of masking tape that said, in Jonas's small, careful handwriting, the word sorry. I took the drive home. I did not plug it into my work laptop. I drove to a strip mall 20 minutes from my apartment, and I bought a cheap refurbished laptop for cash, and I went home and I plugged the drive into that. There were 43 files on the drive. 42 of them were EEG recordings, dated from June through October of the previous year. The 43rd was a text file. I opened the text file first. It said, "If you are reading this, you already know. Please listen to file 41 with headphones. Please do not listen to file 42. I am sorry." Why? I sat with that for a long time. I made myself a cup of tea. I drank half of it. Then I plugged in headphones and I opened file 41. It was 38 minutes long. The first 12 minutes were Jonas talking, in the same careful voice I remembered, walking through what he had done. He had recorded himself. He had used the homemade rig in the wet lab late at night with the lights off and the door locked. He had recorded 8 sessions over the course of 3 months. In each session, he had done the same thing. He had sat in the chair, closed his eyes, and tried to think about nothing. He explained that this was harder than it sounded. He explained that the hiccup, when it appeared, did not appear when he was relaxed. It appeared when he was on the edge of sleep, when the part of his mind that monitors itself had gone quiet. He said he had started to be able to feel it before he could see it on the data. A pressure behind his eyes, a taste in his mouth like copper, the teeth thing. Then he played the audio. He had taken the 7.83 Hz signal from his recordings, isolated the modulation Dawit had told me about, time-shifted it up into the audible range, and rendered it as sound. He said the time-shifting was a violence against the data. He said it would not be what the signal sounded like, if the signal sounded like anything. But it was the closest he could get. He said, "Listen, I am not going to describe the sound. I have thought about how to describe it for a long time, and I have decided that I am not going to. I will say only that it was structured. It was not noise. It had something in it that the part of my brain that recognizes language reached for, the way you reach for a railing in the dark. It was not a language I knew. It was not a language anyone I have ever met would know. But it was a language. I am as sure of that as I am of anything. I listened to it twice. Then I closed the file. Then I sat on my kitchen floor for a while. I did not listen to file 42. I have not listened to it. The drive is in a safe deposit box now, in a bank in a town I will not name, and the key is somewhere I will not say, and I think about it every day. What I did do the next morning was go back into the lab, and I went to Halprin's office, and I closed the door behind me, and I said, "I know about Jonas." He did not look surprised. That was the worst part. He looked tired. He looked at me the way a doctor looks at a patient who has just been told something difficult and is taking it badly. He said, "Sit down." I sat down. He said, "I was going to talk to you this week." He told me in his careful voice that the phenomenon was not new. He said it had been observed in scattered locations for at least 40 years. He said most of the observations had been written off as equipment artifacts or as researcher error, or, in a few cases, as the early stages of psychiatric breaks in the researchers themselves. He said it was only in the last decade that anyone had begun to take it seriously, and the people who had begun to take it seriously were not, on the whole, the people you would want to be taking it seriously. He said he had been approached. He said arrangements had been made. He said the study had been suspended because the people who had approached him had decided that the study had produced enough data, and that further data, particularly data involving subjects who were not aware of what they were being exposed to, was no longer in anyone's interest. I asked him about Dawit. He looked at the surface of his desk for a long moment. He said Dawit had made a different choice than the choice he was now offering me. He did not elaborate. I asked him whether Dawit was alive. He said yes. He said it without hesitation. I believed him then, and I believe him now, although I have not seen Dawit since, and I do not expect to. He said the choice he was offering me was this: I could continue my work on a different project, in a different lab, in a different city. I would be funded, I would be supported. I would never speak to anyone about what had happened in our lab, or about Jonas, or about the recordings, or about the hiccup. Or I could refuse, and the offer would be withdrawn, and I would be free to do whatever I wanted, and he could not promise me what would happen next. But he wanted me to understand that what would happen next would not be dramatic. It would not involve men in dark cars. It would involve, he said, a slow and unremarkable reduction of my professional options over a period of years, until I found myself in a life I did not recognize, doing work I did not want to do, in a place I had not chosen, and I would not be able to point to any single thing that had been done to me. He said, "That is the honest version. I am giving you the honest version because I respect you. Most people don't get the honest version." I asked him what had happened to Priya. He said Priya was fine. She had moved home for the semester. She was doing well. He said it in a way that I could not tell whether it was true. I have looked for her since. I have not found her. The university has no record of a student by that name in that year. I think I am misremembering her name. I think I am misremembering it on purpose. I think part of me does not want to find her, in case finding her would mean finding out something I cannot afford to know. I took the offer. I am not going to pretend I didn't. I took it on a Wednesday afternoon in Halpern's office, and I signed 3 documents, and I did not read all of them carefully, and I have thought about that almost every day since. I told myself I was taking it because I had a mortgage, because I had a partner who was finishing her residency, because I was 34 years old, and starting over was harder than it had been at 26. All of that was true. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was that I had heard the sound on file 41, and I did not want to hear it again, and I understood, without being told, without having to be told, that the people who had approached Halpern had access to it, and to things like it, and to the apparatus that produced it, and that being inside their tent was different from being outside their tent. I understood this in the same animal way I had failed to understand the hiccup on the first night. The understanding came late, and it came whole, and I could not pretend I didn't have it. I work in a different city now. I am not going to say which one. The work is interesting. The work is, in its way, related to what we were doing before, although the connection is not obvious and I am not encouraged to think about it. My partner finished her residency. We have a child. My child is 4. My child is, by every measure I have, a perfectly ordinary child. I watch her sleep sometimes. I watch the small movements of her eyes under her closed eyelids, and I think about the rhythm of those movements, and I make myself stop thinking about it. And I go back to bed. I am writing this down because of something that happened last month. I was at a conference in a city I will not name. A small conference, the kind where you know half the people in the room. During the coffee break on the second day, a woman I had never seen before came up to me and asked whether I had been at the Containment lab in 2017. I said I had. She said she had been a graduate student 2 floors below us. She said she had been thinking about something for a long time, and she wanted to ask me about it, if I didn't mind. I said I didn't mind. I was lying. I minded. But I did not know how to say no. She said, in the spring of that year, the elevator in our building had started doing something strange. The freight elevator. The old one. It would arrive on floors no one had called it to. Not often, maybe once a week, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. The maintenance company had come out 3 times and found nothing wrong. Eventually they had reprogrammed the controller, and the problem had stopped, or had seemed to stop. She had been on the night shift in her own lab during those months, and she had heard the elevator do this 6 or 7 times, and she had noticed something she had not been able to explain to anyone since. The intervals, she said, were not random. She had written them down. She had kept the notebook. She had looked at the numbers years later, when she had learned more signal processing than she had known at the time. The intervals, she said, when you fit them, formed a pattern at 7.83 hertz. Slowed down, she said, stretched across hours, but the same frequency, the same hiccup. She asked me whether I had any idea what that might mean. I told her I didn't. I told her it was probably Maine's hum. I told her it was probably her imagination. I smiled at her, the careful smile I have learned, and I excused myself, and I went to the bathroom, and I stood at the sink for 10 minutes, and I ran the cold water, and I did not look at myself in the mirror. On the flight home that night, somewhere over the dark middle of the country, I closed my eyes and I felt it. The pressure behind the eyes, the taste of copper, the small high note in the teeth. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then it was gone. The man in the seat next to me was asleep. The cabin lights were dimmed. The engines were making the steady sound that engines make. Nothing had happened. I told myself nothing had happened. I have a recurring thought now that I did not have before that flight. The thought is this: the hiccup in our recordings came from the subjects. We measured it at the scalp. We assumed, because we had no reason to assume otherwise, that it was generated inside the skull, by the brain, by some mechanism we did not yet understand. We assumed we were the source. But a brain at rest is also an antenna. A brain at rest is a wet, warm, ion-rich antenna with a surface area, depending on how you count, of something between 2,000 and 2,500 square centimeters. It does not only generate, it also receives. We knew this. We had known this for 100 years. We had simply, in the way of people who are very good at one question, stopped asking it. What if the hiccup was not generated by Priya, and by Jonas, and by the half-dozen other subjects whose data I never got to see? What if it was received by them? What if the brain, in the particular quiet state we were inducing, was tuning? What if the modulation Dawit heard, the structure on the carrier, the thing that sounded almost like language, was not coming from inside? What if it was the other way around? What if something, somewhere, had been transmitting at 7.83 Hertz for a very long time, and we had finally, by accident, by luck, by the specific stupid persistence of 3 or 4 researchers in a leftover lab on the 4th floor of a building no one cared about, built a receiver good enough to hear it? And what if, on the other end of that signal, something had heard us hearing? I do not know if any of this is true. I want to be clear about that. I am a scientist. I have been trained to distrust exactly this kind of thinking. I am aware that a person who has had a frightening experience and signed a document they regret will construct over time a narrative that justifies the experience and ennobles the regret. I am aware that I am that person. I am aware that everything I have just told you could be the slow elaboration of a single bad night in a cold lab 7 years ago. But I will tell you one more thing. 2 weeks ago, on a Saturday morning, my daughter was sitting on the kitchen floor, drawing. She is 4. She draws the way 4-year-olds draw, with great seriousness and no skill. She was humming to herself the way she does. I was making coffee. I was not really listening. Then I was listening. She was humming a single note, a long, steady, even note, with a small wobble in it that I recognized before I understood that I recognized it. I stood at the counter with the coffee scoop in my hand, and I let her hum it for almost a full minute, and I did not move, and I did not breathe. And when she finally stopped and looked up at me and smiled and asked if she could have toast, I said yes, and I made her toast, and I spread butter on it with a hand that was not quite steady, and I gave it to her, and I sat down across from her at the table, and I asked her, as casually as I could, what song she had been humming. She thought about it. She furrowed her small forehead. She said she didn't know. She said it was just a song that was in her head when she woke up. I asked her if it had been in her head for a while. She said yes. She said it had been in her head for a few days. She said it was a nice song. She said sometimes she could hear other people humming it too, but only when she was almost asleep, and only if she didn't try. I told her that was very interesting. I told her to eat her toast. I went into the bathroom, and I closed the door, and I sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. I have not told my partner. I have not told anyone. I am telling you, whoever you are, because I have begun to think that the choice Halperin offered me in his office that afternoon was not the choice I thought it was. I thought I was choosing between speaking and being unmade, between the truth and my life. I thought I was choosing for myself. I think now that the choice was made earlier. I think it was made on the first night, when the hiccup appeared on my monitor, and I leaned back in my chair, and I called David's name across the partition. I think something, on the other end of a very long and very patient line, marked the moment I did that. I think it has been marking moments since. My daughter is asleep upstairs. The house is quiet. The refrigerator is making the small sound it makes. Outside, a car has just gone past on the road, and the sound of its tires on the wet asphalt is fading, and now it is gone, and there is only the refrigerator and the soft tick of the radiator, and somewhere underneath all of it, at a frequency I cannot quite hear and cannot quite stop hearing, the steady, patient hum of something that has been humming for a very long time, and is in no hurry, and has, I think, all the time in the world. I am going to stop writing now. I am going to go upstairs. I am going to stand in the doorway of my daughter's room and listen to her breathe. I am going to listen very carefully. I am going to listen for the wobble.